When the policeman used force against the elderly woman, he was sure he would get away with it. But a few minutes later, her son arrived on the scene. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The evening air in Dallas was warm, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass from a nearby park. The city's skyline stretched high above, illuminated by countless lights that flickered like stars against the darkening sky. Below, the streets hummed with life. Cars wove through traffic, their headlights reflecting off the polished glass of the surrounding skyscrapers. Pedestrians moved along the sidewalks, some engaged in lively conversations, others lost in their own thoughts. The city pulsed with energy, a living, breathing entity that never truly slept. Amidst this urban grandeur stood a historic hotel, a towering relic of another era, its elegant architecture a stark contrast to the modern buildings that loomed around it. Tonight, its grand ballroom was the setting for a prestigious charity event, a gathering of dignitaries, philanthropists, and decorated veterans. The hall was bathed in warm golden light, casting a soft glow over the exquisitely arranged tables adorned with fine china and crystal glassware. The scent of gourmet cuisine lingered in the air, mingling with the subtle perfume of elegantly dressed guests who moved through the room with the practiced grace of high society. At the center of it all was Wilma Scarberry Norris, a woman who, despite her advanced age, carried herself with an air of quiet dignity. Her silver hair was styled neatly, her posture unwavering. She was not just the mother of a legend, she was a legend in her own right. A survivor of the Great Depression, a woman who had raised her children single-handedly, and someone who had lived through more than most could ever imagine. She had been invited to speak tonight, an honor that she accepted not out of vanity, but because she believed in the cause. As she stood before the microphone, her voice, though softened by time, carried a strength that resonated through the room. She spoke of sacrifice, of resilience, of the duty to stand by those who had given everything for their country. She did not embellish her words with theatrics. She did not need to. Her presence alone commanded the respect of those who listened. Veterans nodded solemnly as she spoke, their eyes reflecting memories of battles fought long ago. Younger guests, who had only read about war in history books, hung on to her every word, sensing the weight of experience behind them. As her speech came to an end, the room erupted in applause. Many rose to their feet, not out of politeness, but out of genuine admiration. A few approached her afterward, shaking her hand, offering words of gratitude. Some shared their own stories, brief glimpses into lives that had, in one way or another, been touched by the same struggles she had endured. Wilma listened with the patience of someone who understood that sometimes simply being heard was enough. As the evening wore on, conversations drifted to lighter topics. Laughter rang through the hall, mingling with the soft notes of a string quartet playing in the background. Wilma found herself at a table near the far end of the room, sipping a cup of tea as she observed the people around her. She did not feel out of place among them, though she knew that many here lived lives far different from her own. Wealth and status had never impressed her. She valued character above all else, and tonight she had seen plenty of it in the men and women who had served their country. Eventually, the event began to wind down. Guests began saying their farewells, some exchanging business cards, others making vague promises to meet again soon. Wilma checked her watch. It was getting late. She had agreed to let her son pick her up rather than taking a taxi home. She reached into her purse, fingers searching for the familiar shape of her phone. Outside, the night air was cooler. The streets were quieter now, the rush hour traffic long gone, leaving only the occasional car gliding down the wide avenues. Wilma stepped out of the hotel, pausing on the sidewalk. She looked around, enjoying the peacefulness of the moment. She was unaware that she was being watched. Wilma Norris stood on the sidewalk outside the Grand Hotel, the cool night air brushing gently against her skin. The warm glow of the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the sounds of the city had softened into a distant hum. The evening had been pleasant, filled with thoughtful conversations and heartfelt gratitude from those who had served their country. Yet now, in the stillness of the night, she felt the weight of her age settle into her bones. She reached into her purse, fingers feeling for the familiar shape of her phone, intending to call her son, but she hesitated for a moment, taking in the quiet serenity of the street. A few other guests lingered near the entrance of the hotel, engaged in hushed conversations or waiting for their drivers to arrive. Across the street, neon signs flickered, and a handful of pedestrians walked by, lost in their own affairs. There was no reason for her to feel uneasy, and yet a subtle shift in the atmosphere made her pause. The sensation was faint, like an invisible presence pressing against the edges of her awareness. Unbeknownst to her, a man watched from a short distance away. Officer Daniel Hale stood near the curb, his arms crossed over his chest, his gaze fixed on the elderly woman. He had been stationed near the event earlier in the evening, tasked with overseeing security in the area, but as the hours passed he had grown bored. The charity event had drawn the usual crowd of socialites and dignitaries, people who lived in a world far removed from the realities of the streets. He had no patience for their empty gestures, their carefully curated displays of generosity. In his mind, these events were nothing more than an excuse for the wealthy to pat themselves on the back, while the real work of law enforcement fell to men like him. But it wasn't just the event that irritated him. It was her. Wilma Norris had stood at the podium, speaking with a confidence that grated against his nerves. He had listened to her words, her stories of hardship and perseverance, and all he had heard was another self-righteous lecture. He had seen her type before, people who clung to their past like a badge of honor, expecting the world to bow in deference. She had been praised, applauded, treated like a hero, and now, as she stood alone on the sidewalk, she seemed oblivious to the fact that the world owed her nothing. Hale took a slow breath, his jaw tightening as he made his decision. He stepped forward, his boots making a deliberate sound against the pavement. The few remaining hotel guests paid him no attention as he approached the elderly woman, his expression unreadable. Wilma, still searching for her phone, did not notice him until he was only a few steps away. "Ma'am," he said, his tone flat, his voice carrying the forced politeness of authority. Wilma looked up, her clear blue eyes meeting his gaze. There was no fear in them, only mild curiosity. She had encountered enough law enforcement officers in her lifetime to recognize the type: rigid posture, an air of self-importance, a barely concealed need to assert control. "Something I can help you with, officer?" she asked, her voice steady. Hale studied her for a moment, weighing his words. He could feel the weight of his badge against his chest, a reminder of the power he held in this moment. "I need to see your purse," he said, his tone firm. Wilma raised an eyebrow, her fingers still resting lightly against the edge of her handbag. "Excuse me?" "We've received reports of suspicious activity around this area," Hale continued, his voice carefully measured. "I need to confirm that you're not carrying anything that doesn't belong to you." A slow silence stretched between them. Wilma did not move. Her expression did not change. There was no report, no complaint, no justification beyond Hale's own sense of superiority, his own simmering resentment toward the world and those he deemed undeserving of respect. The street remained quiet, but the tension between them grew palpable. A few feet away, a couple of hotel guests glanced in their direction, though none lingered long enough to intervene. This was the kind of moment that passed unnoticed in the grand scheme of things, an older woman being questioned by a police officer, an interaction that would last no more than a few minutes before the world moved on. But Wilma had not lived as long as she had by surrendering to men like this. "I don't believe that's necessary," she said calmly. "I was just leaving." Hale's fingers twitched slightly. He was used to compliance. He was used to people stepping aside when he demanded it. But this woman, she was unyielding, standing there with an ease that unsettled him. "I wasn't asking," he said, stepping closer. "Hand it over." Wilma sighed softly, shaking her head. She was too old for this, too tired for pointless power struggles. She reached once more for her phone, deciding it was time to call her son. Hale's patience snapped. In one swift motion, he reached out and grabbed her wrist, yanking her arm away from her purse. The movement was rough, meant to startle, meant to remind her of his authority. Wilma stumbled slightly, but did not fall. The pain in her wrist was sharp, but she did not cry out. The murmurs from the hotel guests grew louder. A few more people stopped, their eyes flickering with concern. Someone reached for their phone, but no one intervened. Wilma straightened herself, lifting her chin as she met Hale's gaze once more. "You need to step back," she said, her voice now firm. Hale smirked. The old woman still thought she had a say in this. "Not until I get what I need," he said. Then, without warning, he shoved her. The force of it sent Wilma stumbling backward. Her heel caught on the edge of the curb and she fell. It wasn't a dramatic collapse, no flailing arms or desperate cries. It was quiet, sudden. The impact of her body against the pavement sent a sharp jolt through her, pain flaring in her hip and shoulder. The street fell into stunned silence. For a long moment, no one moved. The few remaining witnesses were frozen in place, unsure of what they had just seen. Hale took a slow step forward, towering over her. He had expected resistance, perhaps an argument, but he had not expected her to fall so easily. For a fleeting moment, he considered offering a hand, pretending as if it had been an accident. But then he saw the way she looked at him, calm, unafraid, as if she had already seen the end of this story before it had even begun. Something cold settled in his stomach. Then the sound of tires screeching against asphalt shattered the silence. Hale's head snapped up just as a large black pickup truck came to a sudden stop a few feet away. The door swung open. The man who stepped out moved with purpose, his stride deliberate, his body coiled with tension. He was dressed simply, jeans, a leather jacket, but there was something unmistakable about the way he carried himself, something that made the air grow thick with anticipation. His face was unreadable, his expression carved from stone, but his eyes burned with a quiet fury. Daniel Hale knew exactly who he was looking at, and for the first time that night, real fear slithered into his veins. Wilma Norris had been waiting for her son, and now Chuck Norris had arrived. The night air in Dallas carried an unusual stillness, a brief pause before an impending storm. The hotel's golden glow cast long shadows across the pavement, but the warmth of the evening had faded, replaced by a tense chill that settled over the street. The scene outside the grand entrance, which had moments ago been nothing more than a quiet farewell to an elegant event, had transformed into something raw, something dangerous. Wilma Norris lay on the pavement, her body momentarily still from the shock of the fall. The sharp pain in her hip radiated through her side, but she did not cry out. Instead, she took a slow, steady breath, pushing aside the instinct to dwell on the discomfort. She had known pain before, had lived through hardships that had tested both her body and her spirit, and she would not allow herself to be diminished now. But the silence that followed her fall was not one of indifference. It was the silence of held breath, the kind that stretched across a crowd just before the breaking point. The bystanders who had watched the encounter unfold stood frozen, their eyes darting between the fallen woman and the towering figure of Officer Daniel Hale. The sound of her body hitting the pavement had been enough to break through the comfortable detachment they had held, enough to turn curiosity into unease. A few people reached for their phones, their fingers hovering over the screen, debating whether to intervene, whether this was one of those moments that would later become a story, a headline, a viral video, but none of them mattered now, because Chuck Norris had arrived. The heavy door of the black pickup had barely finished swinging open before he stepped onto the pavement, his boots landing with a quiet finality. His movements were precise, controlled, yet there was an unmistakable energy coiled beneath the surface, a quiet but overwhelming intensity that radiated off of him like heat from sun-baked asphalt. He was not running, not charging, not giving in to reckless haste. He did not need to, because when Chuck Norris moved, the world adjusted accordingly. The moment Hale's gaze lifted from Wilma, the confidence in his stance wavered. He had been caught in the act, his position suddenly not as assured as it had been just moments before. The officer had spent years wielding authority like a weapon, letting the weight of his badge silence resistance before it could take root. But none of that held meaning in this moment, because the man standing before him was Chuck Norris, and Chuck Norris did not recognize his authority. A flicker of hesitation flashed across Hale's face, but he recovered quickly, straightening his shoulders, planting his feet firmly, as if bracing for a confrontation he still believed he could control. His fingers twitched at his side, hovering near his utility belt, though even he was not foolish enough to reach for his weapon. He was aware of the eyes on him now, of the silent witnesses who had already begun recording, their screens glowing in the dim light. And then there was Wilma. She had already begun to push herself up, her expression calm, her pride intact despite the throbbing pain in her body. Her son's presence was all the assurance she needed, and she met his gaze with quiet understanding. Chuck moved without hesitation, extending a steady hand toward her. Wilma took it, her grip firm despite the sting in her joints, and with minimal effort he helped her to her feet. She did not lean on him, did not let her body slump with the weight of her fall. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, standing tall, facing the man who had tried to make her feel small. Hale shifted, clearing his throat as if attempting to reassert his control over the situation. His eyes flickered toward the growing crowd, the subtle calculation in his gaze betraying his growing awareness that the balance of power had shifted. He needed to regain control before it was completely lost. "She resisted," he said, his voice flat, as if attempting to establish a foundation for his defense before anyone else could take control of the narrative. "She refused a lawful request." Chuck Norris did not respond immediately. He did not need to, because silence, when wielded correctly, could be more suffocating than words. Hale shifted again, discomfort creeping into the edges of his stance. He expected anger, expected a heated response, an accusation, perhaps even a direct challenge to his actions. What he received instead was something far worse: absolute stillness. Chuck's expression did not change. His gaze did not waver. It was the look of a man who had already assessed the situation, already determined the outcome, and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. The weight of that realization settled heavily onto Hale's chest. His breath came a little shallower now, though he fought to keep it even. He had dealt with confrontations before, had been in situations where authority was questioned, but this was different. This was not an argument. This was not a power struggle. This was judgment. And he was on the receiving end of it. A muscle in his jaw tightened as he forced himself to stand his ground. If she had just cooperated, this wouldn't have happened. The words barely left his mouth before the shift in the air became undeniable. It wasn't just the crowd. It wasn't just the quiet murmurs that had begun to ripple through the bystanders. It was Chuck Norris. Because the moment the officer had spoken those words, those careless, dismissive words, something had changed. It was not dramatic. There was no sudden lunge, no outburst of movement. And yet, in that fraction of a second, the certainty of what was about to happen became absolute. Hale swallowed. Chuck took a single step forward. The movement was deliberate, precise, like the shifting of tectonic plates beneath the surface of the earth. Hale felt it before he saw it, the subtle tightening of his own muscles, the instinctual reaction of prey that had suddenly realized it was being hunted. The crowd had gone utterly still. A soft exhale passed through Wilma's lips, not in fear, not in concern, but in quiet inevitability. Because she had seen this before, and she knew exactly what was coming. Hale did not move. He couldn't. His body had locked up, caught between the conflicting impulses of fight and flight, neither of which would serve him now. Chuck Norris did not rush. He did not need to, because his victory had already been decided. And Daniel Hale was about to understand why. The air had shifted. It was subtle at first, like the lingering pressure before a summer storm, but it grew heavier with each passing second. The street lights bathed the pavement in their yellow glow, stretching long shadows across the curb, but all attention was drawn to the black pickup truck that had come to a sudden, forceful stop just a few feet away. The tension, already thick enough to be tangible, now solidified into something undeniable, something raw and unspoken. Chuck Norris had arrived. He moved with a calculated slowness, stepping out of the truck with the kind of presence that did not require spectacle or words to be felt. There was no rush in his movements, no wasted energy, no sign of uncertainty. He was a man who never questioned his own authority, because he had never needed to. The world adjusted to him, not the other way around. Officer Daniel Hale felt it immediately. He had faced opposition before. He had dealt with resistance, with people who challenged his authority, but nothing had ever prepared him for this. This was something entirely different, something that could not be categorized in the standard rules of engagement. He had known from the moment the truck had stopped, before the door had even opened, that he was no longer in control. But it wasn't until Chuck took his first step onto the pavement that the full weight of that realization settled in. He had made a terrible mistake. Wilma Norris did not look surprised. She stood beside her son now, her posture straight despite the dull ache in her hip from where she had fallen. Her expression was calm, unreadable, her eyes flickering with something that was not relief because she had never been afraid, but certainty. She had expected this outcome the moment Hale had laid a hand on her. She had known, without a shadow of a doubt, that Chuck would come, and now that he had, there was nothing left to do but watch. The street, though not completely deserted, had become a frozen tableau. The handful of onlookers, some still holding their phones, stood in complete stillness, their eyes darting between the figures now standing face to face. The silence that had stretched through the moment before Chuck's arrival had now thickened, becoming something impossibly dense, suffocating. Chuck Norris did not speak right away. He didn't need to. Instead, he let the weight of his presence settle, let it take root in the air. His eyes, blue and sharp as a blade against the dim light of the street, locked onto Hale with a steady intensity that did not waver. There was no anger in his expression, no fury or outward hostility. But that was precisely what made it so terrifying. Hale's pulse quickened despite himself. His body tensed, but he forced his shoulders to square, refusing to let himself physically retreat. He was still the one in uniform. He was still the one with the badge, the authority. He had been in situations before where people had tried to intimidate him, had challenged him, but it had never mattered. He had always maintained the upper hand, had always been the one who dictated how things ended. So why did this feel so different? Chuck finally moved again, a single step forward, measured and deliberate. Hale fought the instinct to step back. He knew somehow that retreating would be the equivalent of surrendering completely, that even a fraction of hesitation would be an irreversible admission of defeat. So he did the only thing left to him. He spoke. "She resisted," Hale said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "I gave her a lawful order, and she refused to comply." Chuck did not blink. "She refused to surrender her bag when asked," Hale continued, his fingers twitching slightly at his sides. "She escalated the situation, not me." The lie fell flat before it could even take hold. The crowd knew it. The people who had been standing outside the hotel, who had seen the entire interaction unfold, knew it. And even Hale himself knew it. But he still clung to the structure of his authority, still tried to shape the narrative before it slipped fully out of his grasp. Chuck did not answer. Instead, he turned his head slightly, his gaze flickering to his mother. Wilma, who had been standing in unwavering silence, simply nodded, as if acknowledging the absurdity of what had just been said. She did not need to argue her case. She did not need to plead or explain. Chuck had already seen enough, and then, finally, he spoke. His voice was quiet, controlled, devoid of unnecessary embellishment. "No." That single word carried more weight than anything else spoken that evening. It was not a question, not an argument. It was a statement of fact. It was final, and it shattered Hale's already crumbling illusion of control. For a moment, the officer simply stood there, frozen in place, his body betraying the tension that had settled deep into his muscles. His mind raced, calculating, attempting to find some way to reassert his position, to wrest back even a fraction of the power he had lost. He came to a decision in an instant. He reached for his baton. It was a reflex, a desperate grasp for authority, a conditioned response to a challenge he did not know how to meet. But even as his fingers curled around the handle at his belt, even before he could pull it free, the movement was already a mistake, because Chuck Norris was faster. The moment the officer moved, Chuck shifted. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. He did not need to wait to see what Hale intended, because he already knew. He had spent a lifetime reading the language of conflict, of violence, and he recognized the moment before it happened. And so he struck. His hand shot forward, catching Hale's wrist with a precision that was almost surgical. The force of the impact sent a sharp jolt through the officer's arm, his grip instantly loosening on the baton before it could even be fully drawn. In the same motion, Chuck stepped in, pivoting his body with a speed that defied his age, and with a controlled but undeniable force, he twisted. Hale barely had time to register what was happening before his body followed the motion, his balance completely ripped from beneath him. His feet left the ground for a fraction of a second before he slammed into the pavement with a force that sent a dull crack echoing through the street. His breath left him in a strangled gasp, the wind knocked fully from his lungs. The baton clattered uselessly beside him. The crowd did not cheer. They did not shout. They simply watched, transfixed, as the scene unfolded before them as a man who had, moments ago, held complete authority over this street, now lay sprawled on the pavement beneath Chuck Norris. And Chuck had not even broken a sweat. For a long moment, Hale did not move. His chest heaved as he fought to pull air back into his lungs, his entire body momentarily stunned by the sheer speed and efficiency of the takedown. He had been overpowered before, had even been caught off guard in the past, but nothing had ever felt like this. Because this wasn't just an act of retaliation, this was judgment. Chuck Norris did not look down at him with satisfaction, nor with anger. His expression remained unreadable, as if the outcome had been predetermined, as if this had never been a fight to begin with. Then, finally, he spoke again. "You hit my mother." The words were not loud, not aggressive, but they carried a weight that pressed against the night air like the slow, inevitable pull of gravity. Hale did not answer, because for the first time in his life, he did not know how. The world had changed. It was not in any visible way, not in the way the streetlights flickered or the city hummed with life in the distance, but something in the very air itself had shifted. The moment Chuck Norris had spoken, the moment he had stood between his mother and the man who had dared lay a hand on her, reality had tilted in an irreversible direction. The balance of power had been undone, and nothing could restore it to what it had been before. Daniel Hale lay on the ground, his body twisted in the awkward sprawl of someone who had just been introduced to forces far beyond his comprehension. His breath came in ragged bursts, his chest rising and falling as he struggled to process what had just happened. One moment, he had been in control. One moment, he had been the authority, the one who dictated how the night would end. And then, in the space of a heartbeat, it had all been taken from him. Chuck Norris did not move. He stood there, watching, his stance relaxed but absolute. He did not need to press forward, did not need to loom over the fallen officer to assert dominance. The message had already been sent, the reality already established. Hale had overstepped, had placed his hands where they did not belong, and now he had been put back into the order of things in the only way that truly mattered. The crowd had not moved either. Some clutched their phones, though none had spoken. It was as if the very act of witnessing what had just happened demanded silence, as if any words uttered in this moment would only diminish the weight of it. They had seen a man wielding a badge and a uniform be reduced to nothing in seconds. They had seen justice handed out not through paperwork and bureaucracy, but through something primal, something that transcended rules written on paper. Wilma Norris watched as well. There was no surprise in her expression, no shock or disbelief. She had known what would happen the moment she had seen her son step out of that truck. She had known, just as surely as she had known the feel of Texas soil beneath her feet as a child, that this was an inevitability. Chuck did not tolerate injustice, did not look the other way when those who were meant to serve instead used their power to harm. He had always been this way. And now Daniel Hale was learning that lesson in the only way it could be taught. Hale groaned, his fingers twitching against the pavement as he attempted to push himself upright. Pain radiated through his arm where Chuck had gripped him, and humiliation burned in his gut with an intensity that nearly outmatched the physical ache. He had never been handled like this before, never been put down so efficiently, so effortlessly. He gritted his teeth, forcing his body to cooperate, forcing himself to rise despite the silent eyes upon him. Chuck still had not moved. Hale's pulse thundered in his ears. He should have been angry, should have felt the rush of fury that came with being challenged, with being put in his place. But all he felt was fear. It was unfamiliar, unwelcome, but undeniable. It clung to him, wrapped around his spine and coiled in his stomach, whispering the truth that his pride refused to acknowledge. He was outmatched, completely, utterly, irrevocably. Chuck took a slow step forward. It was not an aggressive motion, not a lunge or an attack, but it sent a tremor through Hale's entire body nonetheless. His feet instinctively shifted backward, his weight redistributing as though his very muscles had betrayed him, recognizing the danger before his mind could catch up. But there was no escaping this now. "You hit my mother," Chuck said again, and this time it was not just a statement. It was a verdict. Hale swallowed, his throat dry, his pulse hammering. He could not afford to show weakness, could not afford to let this man think he had been defeated. His entire life had been built on the foundation of control, of enforcing authority with his presence alone. He had stood in front of criminals, had dealt with men who thought themselves tough, and he had never backed down. But Chuck Norris was not like those men. There was no bravado in his stance, no arrogance in his expression. He did not carry himself like a man who needed to prove his strength, because his strength was self-evident. He did not threaten, because threats were only necessary when doubt existed, and there was no doubt here, only certainty. Hale opened his mouth, forcing words to come, forcing himself to salvage whatever shreds of dignity he had left. "She resisted," he said, and even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were worthless. Chuck took another step. Hale's hands twitched, instinctively moving toward his belt, toward the tools that had always served as his crutch, his assurance that he would always have the upper hand. The baton, the cuffs, the weight of the badge. None of it meant anything now. Chuck's eyes flickered downward, just briefly, as if noting the movement before returning to Hale's face. He did not need to say anything. The silence that followed was worse than any words could have been. Hale clenched his jaw. He could not stand there and let this happen, could not allow himself to be reduced to nothing in front of the very people he was supposed to control. His fingers tightened, his muscles tensed, and then, before he could even think to act, Chuck moved. It was fast, too fast. Hale barely registered the shift before pain exploded through his chest. It was not just a punch. It was a force of nature, a strike that carried the weight of years of discipline, of power honed into something far beyond simple violence. The impact sent him staggering back, breath vanishing from his lungs as his spine crashed against the hood of his own patrol car. The metal groaned beneath the force. The world tilted, his vision blurring at the edges. He tried to focus, tried to regain some semblance of control, but the pain in his ribs told him all he needed to know. He had lost. Chuck did not press forward this time. He did not need to. The fight, if it had ever truly been a fight, was already over. Hale coughed, struggling to push himself upright, struggling to comprehend how everything had unraveled so quickly. His hands fumbled uselessly at his sides, and then he felt it. His cuffs. The ones meant for those he deemed criminals. The ones he had always used as a final declaration of power. Chuck saw it. For the first time that night, amusement flickered in his eyes. Not mockery, not arrogance. Just something cold and knowing. "You want to arrest someone?" Chuck said, his voice quiet but sharp as a blade. Hale's fingers trembled. He could not move. And then the sirens came. The distant wail of approaching police units shattered the heavy silence, red and blue lights cutting through the darkness. The crowd stirred, their whispered voices rising as more officers arrived, their vehicles screeching to a stop. Doors flew open, uniforms stepping onto the pavement, hands instinctively hovering near their weapons as they took in the scene before them. And at the center of it all, Chuck Norris stood unmoved. Hale sagged against his patrol car, his body screaming in protest. But the worst part was not the pain. It was the knowledge that even with the arrival of reinforcements, even with the badge still pinned to his chest, nothing would change the truth of what had just happened. He had lost, and now there was nothing left but the consequences. The red and blue lights cut through the darkness, flickering against the polished glass of the hotel's facade, casting warped reflections across the pavement. The wail of sirens filled the air, their echoes stretching through the streets of Dallas, announcing the arrival of law and order in a city where, just moments ago, order had already been delivered, not by a badge, not by bureaucracy, but by the sheer force of will of one man. Chuck Norris had not moved. He stood as he had stood before, feet planted, arms relaxed at his sides, his expression unwavering. There was no fear in his stance, no concern as the doors of police vehicles swung open and officers spilled onto the street, their hands instinctively hovering near their belts, their eyes scanning the scene with the rapid calculation of men trained to assess threats. But there was no immediate action, no shouting, no weapons drawn, because even they, arriving late to the story that had already been told, could feel it. The atmosphere was thick with it, with something beyond words, beyond the procedural steps they had been taught to follow. They saw Daniel Hale slumped against the hood of his own patrol car, his breath coming in shallow, pained gasps, one hand clutching his ribs as if that alone could mend what had been broken. They saw the bystanders, frozen in uneasy silence, their phones still lifted, capturing every frame, documenting what no amount of damage control could erase. And then, finally, they saw him. Chuck Norris. The name was not one they had expected to encounter tonight, but it was a name every man in uniform recognized, a name that carried with it a weight that transcended fame, that carried an unspoken understanding of what it meant to stand in his presence. Some of them had trained under his philosophy, had grown up watching him embody the very discipline they had sworn to uphold. Some had whispered his name in jest, in the tall tales and exaggerated myths that surrounded his legend, but no one joked now, because this was no myth. This was reality. One of the officers, a sergeant by the markings on his uniform, stepped forward. His name tag read Harrison, and his face, though hardened by years on the force, held a flicker of uncertainty. He had not been here to see how it had started, had only arrived in time to witness the remnants of a fight that had already ended. He looked at Hale, at the way his fingers twitched against the pavement, at the shame and barely contained rage in his eyes, and he understood. Hale had lost. Badly. And now it was on him to determine what happened next. "Somebody want to tell me what the hell is going on here?" Harrison's voice cut through the silence, sharp but not aggressive. He was trying to regain control, to reassert command over a situation that had long since slipped beyond procedure. No one answered right away. Not the crowd, not Hale, and certainly not Chuck. Instead, it was Wilma Norris who finally spoke. Her voice was steady, unwavering, carrying with it the weight of a woman who had lived through enough years to see the world for what it was, who had faced worse men than Daniel Hale and had never once bowed to them. She spoke simply, with no embellishment, no unnecessary emotion. "He hit me," she said. 3 words, and that was all it took. The crowd shifted, murmurs rising among them, the energy shifting once more. Several people stepped forward, voices overlapping, each eager to confirm what they had seen, what their phones had already captured. The words spilled out in a wave: unprovoked attack, excessive force, assault on an elderly woman. And all the while, Hale sat in his own silence, the truth of the accusations pressing against him like the weight of a collapsing building. He could argue, could try to twist the narrative in his favor, but there was no victory here. No words that could undo what had already been recorded, what had already been witnessed. Sergeant Harrison turned to Chuck then, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if weighing the implications of speaking to a man who had already rendered his own form of justice before the system could intervene. "You put him down." Chuck met his gaze, his voice as steady as ever. He got up. Harrison exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. That answer alone told him everything he needed to know. He had been in this business long enough to recognize when the right men won and the wrong ones lost. He looked at Hale, the officer he had known for years, had taken complaints about, had heard whispers of misconduct surrounding, and he knew in that moment that no backup in the world could change the facts. Hale had done this to himself. Harrison nodded once, as if finalizing his own verdict. He turned to one of the other officers, a younger patrolman whose nervous energy made it clear he was new to the force. "Cuff him." The words landed like a stone in the dead air. For a split second, Hale did not react, did not seem to comprehend that the command had been directed at him. But as the officer hesitated, stepping forward cautiously, realization struck. His body went rigid, his breath coming faster, and the flicker of fear that had taken root in his chest bloomed into full-fledged panic. "No," Hale rasped, shaking his head. "You can't." "Officer Hale," Harrison cut him off, his voice brooking no argument. "You're under arrest for assault and excessive use of force. You'll be taken into custody and processed accordingly. If you've got anything to say, save it for your lawyer." The younger officer stepped forward, his hand steady now as he pulled the cuffs free from his belt. Hale recoiled, his pride warring against the reality of the situation, but there was no escaping it. Not this time. His fingers curled into fists, his eyes darting toward Chuck, as if looking for something, anything, to justify what had happened. But Chuck did not give him that satisfaction. He did not gloat, did not smirk, did not speak. He simply stood, watching as the cuffs were clicked into place, as Hale's fate was sealed. The crowd reacted in waves. Some murmured in approval, some remained silent, and others simply lifted their phones higher, ensuring that this too was recorded. Justice, after all, was rarely handed out so directly, so definitively. But tonight it had been. Wilma stepped beside her son, her presence as steady as ever. She did not need to say thank you, did not need to acknowledge what he had done for her. He had done it not for recognition, not for applause, but because it was right. Because no one, no matter their title, their uniform, their authority, had the right to raise a hand against the innocent. As Hale was led to the waiting patrol car, his head bowed in shame, Chuck turned to his mother. "Are you all right?" Her lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "I will be," she said, and with that, Chuck nodded, guiding her toward his truck. The night was over. Justice had already been served. The distant wail of sirens that had once felt like a warning had now become something else entirely. A confirmation. A declaration that what had transpired tonight was no longer contained within the small stretch of sidewalk in front of the hotel. No longer a moment that could be ignored or dismissed. The truth had already been seen, recorded, and now it was being answered. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the polished windows of the surrounding buildings, dancing in sharp, jagged patterns across the pavement as police cars screeched to a halt. The weight of their arrival pressed down upon the moment, shifting the energy of the street once again. But Chuck Norris remained unchanged. He stood where he had stood before, his body relaxed, his breathing steady, his expression unreadable. The world moved around him, adjusting, reacting, but he did not. The fight, if it could even be called that, was already over. His part in it had concluded the moment Daniel Hale had hit the pavement, the moment the officer had understood, too late, that he had chosen the wrong battle with the wrong man. And now, as more officers exited their vehicles, hands hovering near their belts, eyes scanning the scene with the sharpness of trained professionals assessing a volatile situation, Chuck simply waited. The crowd had grown, drawn in by the spectacle, by the undeniable force of what they had just witnessed. Some murmured among themselves, others recorded quietly, their phones capturing the unfolding moment with the same unflinching gaze that Chuck himself held. They had seen the truth of it already, had watched as power had been abused and then corrected. They knew who the aggressor had been. And now it was time to see whether the system would agree. Sergeant Harrison moved first. His expression was unreadable, his posture that of a man balancing his duty with the understanding that what had happened here tonight was not as simple as a procedural report would later try to make it. He looked at Daniel Hale, still slumped against the patrol car, his hands now cuffed, his breath ragged. He had been on this force long enough to know what had happened even before hearing a single word. The bruises forming on Hale's face, the way his fingers still curled inward as if clutching at something that had already slipped through them, it was all the proof he needed. Harrison exhaled through his nose, glancing toward the onlookers. "Anyone here want to tell me exactly what happened?" He didn't need to wait long. Voices rose, overlapping in their urgency, each retelling the same story in different ways. Some spoke quickly, their words tumbling over each other in the rush to be heard, while others spoke with measured certainty, recounting the events with the clarity that only came from witnessing something truly undeniable. But the core of their statements remained the same. Daniel Hale had attacked an elderly woman. Daniel Hale had abused his power. Daniel Hale had hit Wilma Norris, and Daniel Hale had been stopped. Harrison listened, his expression not changing, his gaze flickering between the crowd and the man in question. Hale did not speak. His head was lowered slightly, his jaw tight, his breathing measured in a way that betrayed the simmering humiliation beneath the surface. He had no defense, no justification. His actions were not only witnessed, they were recorded, preserved in the digital memories of the dozens of phones still held aloft, their screens reflecting the red and blue of the flashing lights. When the voices finally died down, Harrison turned his gaze toward Chuck. He had known who he was from the moment he had stepped out of the truck, had recognized him before he had even been close enough to make out his face. There were few men whose reputations preceded them with such certainty, whose names carried the weight of unshakable respect, even in a world where legends were often exaggerated. But this was not exaggeration, it was fact. Harrison studied him for a moment, then spoke. "Mr. Norris?" Chuck gave a slight nod. "Sergeant." A pause stretched between them, not tense, not confrontational, just a moment of quiet understanding. "You put him down?" Harrison asked, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. Chuck's voice was even, calm. "He got back up." Harrison let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly. He turned back toward Hale, who had finally lifted his head, his eyes filled with the desperate, simmering anger of a man who knew he had lost but refused to accept it. "You really hit an old woman?" Harrison's voice was low, almost disbelieving. Hale's lips pressed into a tight line, his jaw working as if he were trying to form words, but couldn't find any that would save him. He could have denied it, could have fought against the inevitable, but he knew, just as surely as everyone else on this street knew, that there was no room for lies anymore. Harrison's disappointment was clear, but there was no sympathy in it, only resignation. "Get him out of here," he said, gesturing toward one of the other officers. The younger patrolman hesitated for only a second before moving forward, gripping Hale's arm and guiding him toward the waiting squad car. The walk felt longer than it was, every step echoing with the weight of his disgrace. The door was opened, and without another word, he was pushed inside. The door slammed shut behind him, sealing his fate as definitively as Chuck's fist had sealed it before. The crowd shifted again, whispers rising among them. Some clapped, some simply nodded to themselves, as if reassured by what had just happened. Justice, so often elusive, had been delivered in the simplest and most direct way possible. Harrison turned back to Chuck. "You want to press charges?" Wilma, who had remained quiet through most of this, finally stepped forward. Her gaze, steady and sharp, met the sergeant's. "I just want to go home," she said. Harrison nodded. It was enough. With a final glance toward the remaining officers, he gave a short command to clear the scene. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves, their attention already shifting toward what would come next. Some still watched Chuck as he moved, as he placed a careful hand on his mother's shoulder and guided her toward the waiting truck. The night was over, but the story would live on. As Chuck opened the passenger door, helping Wilma into her seat with the same gentle care that had always defined his strength, a voice called out from the remaining crowd, "Mr. Norris." He turned, his expression unreadable. A young woman, no older than 20, stood near the curb, her phone still in hand, but now lowered. There was awe in her gaze, admiration, but not just for what he had done. "For your mother," she said. Wilma smiled softly, a flicker of something warm passing through her features. Chuck said nothing. He simply gave a slight nod before stepping into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, the low, steady growl of a machine as dependable as the man who drove it. As the truck pulled away from the curb, the street remained behind, forever changed by what had transpired. The echoes of the fight, of the fall, of the justice delivered without hesitation, would linger here long after the headlights disappeared into the Dallas night. And Daniel Hale, sitting in the back of a squad car, his wrists bound in the same metal he had once wielded against others, would have the rest of his life to understand exactly why. The city stretched out before them as the black pickup rolled steadily down the quiet streets, the echoes of the night still lingering in the silence between mother and son. The flashing lights had faded behind them, swallowed by the distance, but the weight of what had happened remained. Dallas had witnessed something tonight. It had seen justice delivered not in a courtroom, not through drawn-out proceedings and legal maneuvering, but in the most direct, unshakable way possible. The story would spread, whispered between bystanders, captured in videos that would find their way onto the screens of millions. But inside the truck, none of that mattered. Chuck Norris drove with the same calm control he had displayed throughout the night, his hands steady on the wheel, his expression unreadable. He had always been a man of action, a man who did what needed to be done without hesitation, but that did not mean he did so without thought. The adrenaline had long since settled, the immediate need for response had passed, and now, as the city lights flickered past the windows, there was only reflection. Wilma sat beside him, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. There was no sign of fear, no lingering distress in her posture. She had never been the kind of woman to cower in the face of adversity. Even now, after being knocked to the ground, after being forced to endure a moment of cruelty she had not deserved, she remained as she always had been, resilient, unwavering. The pain in her hip still throbbed dully, but it was nothing she had not endured before. Pain was an old companion. For a long time neither of them spoke. The truck rumbled beneath them, the quiet hum of the engine filling the space where words might have been. But Chuck knew his mother well enough to understand that silence did not mean uncertainty. She was not waiting for him to say something profound, not expecting him to offer words of reassurance. She did not need them. Still, after several minutes, he finally broke the quiet. "Are you sure you're all right?" Wilma turned her head slightly, studying him. The streetlights cast long shadows over his face, emphasizing the hard lines that time had etched into his features. He was not a young man anymore, though to most he seemed as invincible as he had always been. He was still Chuck Norris, the fighter, the warrior, the legend, but to her he was still just her son. She offered a small, knowing smile. "I've been through worse." Chuck exhaled slowly, his fingers flexing against the wheel. He had known she would say that, but it did not ease the slow burn of anger still simmering beneath his skin. He had been raised on the values of discipline and restraint, on the belief that strength was meant to protect, not to harm. And tonight he had been forced to watch as a man who had sworn an oath to uphold justice had instead used his power for cruelty. "You didn't have to do what you did," Wilma said after a moment, though there was no reproach in her voice. Chuck glanced at her, his jaw tightening slightly. "Yes, I did." Wilma nodded once, as if acknowledging something she had always known to be true. Chuck had never been the kind of man to stand by when others were wronged. It was not in his nature to watch injustice unfold and do nothing. And when it was his own mother who had been harmed, there had never been another outcome. "You didn't let him get away with it," she said simply. "That matters." Chuck said nothing. He didn't need to. They drove on, the city thinning as they left the heart of downtown behind. The buildings grew shorter, the lights less frequent. The road stretched long ahead of them, leading toward the quiet familiarity of home. Chuck had spent his life moving through the world, had fought on countless battlefields, both real and cinematic, had been many things to many people. But in the end, he always came back here. Wilma let her gaze drift toward the window, watching as the city gave way to quieter streets. What do you think will happen to him? She did not need to specify who she meant. Chuck kept his eyes on the road. He'll be processed, booked. He'll get his day in court like everyone else. Wilma hummed softly. And what if they let him off easy? Chuck's grip on the wheel tightened slightly, but his voice remained even. They won't. Wilma studied him again, taking in the certainty in his tone. She had seen many injustices in her lifetime, had watched men escape the consequences of their actions simply because they held the right title or wore the right uniform. But she also knew that what had happened tonight had not been something that could be buried. There had been too many witnesses, too many cameras. The world had already seen the truth. They'll talk about this for a long time, she mused. Chuck simply nodded. She sighed softly, leaning back against the seat. Well, if nothing else, I suppose it makes for a good story. A flicker of amusement crossed Chuck's face, brief but genuine. Yeah, it does. The silence between them this time was comfortable. The weight of the night was still there, but it no longer pressed down on them so heavily. The road ahead stretched long and open, the kind of road that offered clarity, that allowed for the unwinding of tension, the settling of thoughts. After a while, Wilma glanced at him again. You know, I don't think I ever really thanked you. Chuck looked at her, his expression softening just slightly. You don't have to. She smiled again, small and warm. I know. They drove on, the road taking them further from the noise of the city, further from the flashing lights and the weight of what had been left behind. There would be consequences for what had happened tonight. There would be hearings and statements, reports filed and stories told. But in the end, none of that mattered, because justice had already been served. And as long as Chuck Norris was in this world, it always would be. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Don't forget to check out other videos on the channel and share this one with your friends. More great content is coming soon. Stay tuned.